What's up, Midwestern Marks, comrades, fans, friends? I'm here with Evan of the Left of the Projector podcast. Doing something a little unique today. For us, anyways, this is kind of what Evan does over on his channel or with his podcast. A movie review of Oliver Stone's, what is it, 1986 movie, I believe.
Yep.
Um, yeah, 1986 movie Platoon. So a classic, and a movie that's very critical of the Vietnam War. So thanks for being with us, Evan.
Yeah. Thanks for having me so much. Appreciate it. Yeah. This is a great movie, and really, I feel like it's one of the few times you actually get like an anti-Vietnam War or any anti-war movie at all in Hollywood. So I think it's worth talking about.
For sure. I'm sure you know better about this than me, but it's kind of crazy when you look into the influence that the DoD and the Pentagon and the U.S. government in general, or the U.S. empire in general, how much control they have over Hollywood.
Yeah.
Um,
There's a lot. I actually just ordered a book that I'm waiting to get that goes into this even further. But I mean, starting in the '80s, they basically were any movie where there is any military presence, you have to get it approved by the Pentagon. They have their own office, their own section, and it's only grown. Like think of the movie Top Gun. I mean, it's like the ultimate example. I think when I think of movies like that where the Pentagon just wrote the script, basically.
Right, literally, the DoD was involved with all the filming. I just learned that today, that rule that you said about the military, where if you use any military gear, then you have to follow very strict guidelines as to how you're supposed to portray the U.S. military. So
Right. They don't want, like, if you have a World War II movie, they want it to be in a positive light. I think being this movie being like anti-Vietnam War, I'm sure I often wonder like how much worse was this movie originally before they probably changed it. It might have been even more critical. And
hmm
so it's interesting to see how much Oliver Stone got through. I mean, he's a pretty prolific, movie writer, director. So he had a little bit of sway in Hollywood, I suspect.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy that he's been able to have the career he's had, given his borderline tanky politics. Basically, I mean, he has one movie about JFK from a while back, and then another movie about JFK, basically saying everything we said about JFK has now been confirmed by evidence.
Yep.
He's got a movie now, Ukraine on Fire, about the conflict in Ukraine, the U.S. NATO coup in 2014. Like, there's no issue he's afraid to tackle, really. So it's impressive that he's had such a successful career as a director.
And it's funny. I feel like he's had movies that kind of go both ways. Like Born on the 4th of July is like kind of, I don't want to call it like glorification completely because he definitely still has his little spin on it. But yeah, I mean, he's really made a career out of not being afraid to go after, you know, American imperialism and American intervention. And Vietnam War, like I feel like is one of those wars where, you can actually criticize it and it's not as bad as if you criticize, like World War II or something like that.
Right. At least at this point, years
Yeah.
later, we have the Pentagon Papers now and all this leaked information about um, all the lies that were told to get us into Vietnam, and um,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's funny. I think I was telling you before is I was kind of skimming this section in this book, Killing Hope by William Blum, where he talks about the Pentagon Papers. I think the new updated version did. And all the things that we did to get into Vietnam is just pretty much insane. I mean, it's no different than any war that the U.S. engaged. I mean, it's very similar, I think, to the Korean War. I think I was talking about how they involve themselves and they use the pretense of, oh well, the North was attacking the South is kind of like their go-to line, right?
yeah, it's very similar. And then you have the U.S. There is more obviously ground presence in Vietnam than Korea, but you have the U.S. trying to just back their preferred groups and basically do aerial bombing campaigns, almost indiscriminately, targeting civilians. Obviously, 20% of the North Korean population was killed. So,
Yeah, I think the number I was seeing for Vietnam is after effects of napalm is somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 million Vietnamese, either
wow.
deaths or long-term lasting effects of it. And then I'm sure, and then I think it's 600,000 American troops, something crazy. Maybe that's a little bit
Wow.
high. Maybe that's slightly high. I thought it was 600,000,
And
but it's
that
a
doesn't,
lot.
yeah, and then I mean that doesn't even include Cambodia,
That's
where
true, right? I don't
Henry
know if the 3
Kissinger,
million includes Cambodia or not.
right? That's where Kissinger said if it flies or moves, bomb it, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Platoon they do a good job of, as we'll get into the movie, I think, but I think
For
that they
sure.
do a good job of showing really what the strategy was, which was surround a village, burn it to the ground, and if they get overtaken, just napalm the crap out of it and just destroy them. It wasn't really, there was no strategy at all. And actually, there was a good quote that I found from another book I was skimming through was Michael Harris Dispatches, which was him in I think 1967 to 69, something like that, where he basically spent time interviewing people, and he said something to the effect of I'll have to find the exact quote, but it's pretty damning. Oh, it says they killed a lot of communists, but that's all they did because the number of communists dead meant nothing. Nothing changed. So they weren't going after hearts and minds. They were just killing commies.
Right, literally. I mean, and that's what's it's so ironic. We're gonna stop the spread of communism by killing millions of people because the communists might kill people. Um,
The famous American double standard.
right, literally. And I like one of my favorite scenes. And spoiler alert, I guess, for the movie as we're kind of getting into it now. But Elias, the sergeant who kind of shows the good or the represents the humanity of the soldiers, which is a major theme of this movie.
Yep.
Which I think says something about Stone and his sort of patriotism or love of America or not wanting America to be what it is a major theme in a lot of his movies. And yeah, Elias is just talking about like I thought this war was winnable when I came here, but now I recognize it's not. We're literally just killing and being killed for no reason. Which, and you think about all the Vietnam troops who came back with PTSD, like what kind of mental toll did that take on them to realize, basically they were being lied to. And a lot of them kind of figured out they were fighting for nothing except capital expansion.
Yeah. I mean, in Dispatches, he interviews a lot of people, and obviously they take photos. And he was saying he would meet kids, literally they're kids that are like 19, 20, and he would look in their eyes and say they look like they're 30 or 40 just because the effects of that war just turn them into shells. Literally they're just husks of people that they had to just keep going. They had no other choice. And I think that like the one major theme that I think is a good starting point for the movie is just why are we there? Like, what's the point of this war? And I think Charlie Sheen's character, who's sort of the main point of view of the movie, I think the very first line he says, or his second line, is like, "What the fuck am I doing?" He's just walking on. He already doesn't understand this.
Yeah, and as soon as he lands, he sees someone come out in a body bag.
Yeah.
And I thought one of the more interesting parts of the movie was the class dynamics. They made Charlie Sheen, he wasn't someone, the main character wasn't someone who got drafted. He was a volunteer from the middle class who truly thought he was going to serve his country. And I mean, right away, like 15 minutes into the film, he's saying, most of the people here are poor or from the end of the line. And he says, fighting for our society and fighting for our freedom, even though, they live in poverty. Which is, yeah, there's a lot to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's even crazier is he says later he was in college. He drops out of college, and it's like a fu to his parents who like want him to be this, I don't know, like kind of like the standard, middle class, upper middle class kind of person. And he drops out of college, to his parents' dismay, and joins Vietnam. And other people around him can't believe it. They're like, "We're here because we have no other choice," And I think a lot of the thing about Vietnam, especially, is that I think I saw that only 25% of the soldiers actually were drafted. So 75% of Vietnamese were actually enlisted.
Wow.
And it's mostly from the South, and they're exploited because they have no other course. They don't even have diplomas. I think he says that. I think it's kids here with high school diplomas or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a testament to U.S. propaganda. That's a testament to McCarthyism and the amount of anti-communist sentiment that there was at the time. And just what we say today, that you basically don't even need a draft because economic conditions are so bad. The military is what a lot of people see as their only way out. A lot of poor
Yeah, no,
people.
it's true. It's funny. The movie I did a couple. The most recent episode was on Forrest Gump, which I think is like such an opposite version of this. It's like super propaganda pro-war, and in that
Mhm.
they talk about how a bunch of kids from Alabama, like he was, go into the military because they have no. He has a college degree, but he has no he doesn't have like a rich family member or some job lined up. So these kids had nothing, and in America in the mid 1960s wasn't exactly the American dream that that they were being sold.
Right.
For a large segment of America anyway.
For sure. And it is also, you not only see him with his platoon squadron or his comrades. Not only do they have a difference in class, but or they have different reasons for being there. A lot of them were
Yeah,
drafted or forced in. He chose to go. But then you think about the Viet Minh or the Vietnamese civilians, like they had this death, destruction, and warfare literally brought to their doorstep for no reason, for trying to go forward with a system of governance where they brought themselves out of poverty and educated people and did things for the social good, all the things. They tried to create a socialist society, and because of that, you know tons and tons of Agent Orange and napalm were brought to them. And you think about that or I thought about that with the scene where they go into the village and end up committing a massacre and torching this civilian village. Because before that, the soldiers see their comrades who have been killed, and one of them has been hung up on a pole, and it makes them angry. They want revenge, but and that's a normal human reaction at that point in the movie. You empathize with them, but the U.S. is at Vietnam's doorstep. They're literally just defending their home. So U.S. troops are basically in this impossible position where they had to fight for the imperial death machine, and hate these people who really had done nothing. And you see, like, there were so many massacres committed in Vietnam, partially because there was like no oversight, but also just because the U.S. was constantly losing. They didn't know how to fight on this terrain. They were, the soldiers were constantly in fear and paranoid, which they do a very good job of portraying in the movie. And they would freak out and do things like massacre civilians and torch the whole village. And it does. The movie, above all else, I think it does a great job of showing how senseless the war was and how it was just, from a human rights perspective and even from an economic perspective, when you look at the way Vietnam's infrastructure was blown up, um, just a senseless disaster. Oh, you're muted, Evan. On me.
yeah. The scene you're talking about, they, you know, it's almost like well, another thing about the movie too is you were talking about there's sort of like this split amongst the troops, going with sort of like the crazy, we're gonna just be senseless killers, versus the people who are understand how ridiculous the war is. And it's I think that's a good, probably actually what was happening. People there just were counting the days until they could go home. They're just going to try and get through it. And other people just like, I can live out my fantasy to just kill a bunch of people. And unfortunately, I think that was partly their own beliefs, maybe, and also just, I mean, I can't imagine what that does to your, like, just to your psyche, being there and seeing this, and you just want to be part of it, right? You think you're being told that these Vietnamese are monsters, like destroying the American way of life, and so you just lash out. And they and Charlie Sheen's character tries to, he steps in when a woman is being raped, saying this and not to do it, and he's trying to be a good person, but he's one against many. So that whole scene is just, there's probably hundreds of those, like the Malay
Yeah,
massacre. There's another one,
exactly,
good
right.
old John
And
McCain.
right. And you have Barnes too, the sergeant who kind of, you have there's one sergeant, Elias, who kind of represents the soldier's humanity, and like you said, understanding what the war is and that it's not winnable and that it's senseless. And then you have this crazed Sergeant Barnes who represents, like you said, just kind of losing yourself in the violence and fulfilling this fantasy. And there's such a good line at one point. He says, like, I'm gonna go back to America and I'm gonna be a war hero. They're going to give me medals. I'm going to be decorated. He's probably right. Look at the American Sniper movie about Chris Kyle, celebrated for killing a bunch of Iraqis, a country that we illegally and offensively invaded, killing millions of people at the behest of multinationals and oil companies. And, he comes back and there's a movie made about him, a shitty movie that wins Best Picture.
That movie's terrible.
It is. So, yeah, it shows how we celebrate violent war criminals, and it creates a certain kind of person.
Yeah,
or breeds a certain kind of person, I guess.
Yeah, I mean the entire thing, like, So and one thing that's just a complete aside to anyone who maybe hasn't seen this movie, the cast is also just insanely, like, from end to end, everyone is like a great actor. Like, you probably would recognize everyone in this movie. Charlie Sheen, Willem Dafoe, Forrest Whitaker. I think true. Even Johnny Depp is in the movie too, which is like a little side character, and Keith David. I mean, it's just packed full of people. It's just a little side note, just because it's a war movie doesn't mean they didn't have some seriously good acting too.
Yeah, I noticed that too. And when Johnny Depp was just like a random guy who died in the woods, I was like, whoa, there's a lot of good actors in this movie. The one, I guess, this is a good comment from Papa Squats here that says, do you think it's a disservice to the Vietnamese when focusing attention on the American loss, PTSD, deaths, etc., as opposed to focusing on the Vietnamese experience? That would be, after watching the film, I thought that was my one critique, was I would have liked to see a Viet Minh character, or some kind. I mean, they have you emphasize with the civilians, but never even really with the troops or the people fighting, who, like I said, are people defending their country.
Right. They're not offensive.
Right. No, they're actually fighting for freedom. So yeah. And if you want to take a stab at that question.
Yeah. Too. I mean, I think that's probably like easily like the biggest criticism of the movie. And I think probably in Oliver Stone's head, he's not looking at it from that. I mean, being American, you can say that's his perspective. He's making this movie to critique America's involvement in the war. And I don't really think there's any, I'm trying to think if there's any movies about the Vietnam War where you kind of get the Vietnamese perspective. And the only thing I can think of in Apocalypse Now, you do kind of get that American siding with, Vietnam, but you don't get it from a humanitarian perspective. You get it from like this guy went crazy and now he's joined the Viet Cong or something. So yeah, I would agree that it's a little bit not surprising.
Right. And I mean, that's interesting that I haven't seen Apocalypse Now, but that's interesting that they portray him as crazy, because there were quite a few American troops in Korea who switched sides, and there were cases of that in Vietnam. Like, I think that would make an interesting movie. Follow these people who switch sides, and hear why they did it. Whether it had anything to do with the human rights abuses they were committing, or if they were disillusioned. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of crazy that people switch sides. But
yeah, I mean, so I think in one of the in the book that I was looking through, Dispatches, he mentions a couple times how, because the movie Apocalypse Now, I think, is based on part of the story that came from that book. I think some of the script was written by him as the journalist who was there. So in that movie, it's like Marlon Brando plays this decorated special forces colonel who goes rogue. Basically, that's his. And it's based in Cambodia, so it's not quite. It's close to Vietnam. They're on the border. But that movie is pretty much. It's a different movie and much darker than this.
I'll have to give that a watch sometime. I noticed we were talking about this before the stream. There's actually a movie that came out like 2 years after Platoon. It's like this low budget movie called platoon leader. So I mean, clearly a ripoff, and the film received criticism for it. It only made $1 million at the box
Yeah.
office, so not a successful film. But basically, the whole point is to glorify war. You know, the soldiers are basically superheroes gunning down the evil Viet Minh, or Viet Cong as they're referred to by the American troops. And yeah, and there's even a line in that movie. I was reading about it a little bit because it fascinated me. There's a line in that movie where they're fighting the Viet Minh, and one of them comes up and says, now I finally know why we're fighting this war. Meaning, like, because those Viet Minh are so evil and nasty and bad, we just got to take them all down. It's fun. I mean, it just shows the stupidity of imperialist arguments compared to this movie, Platoon, which is critical of imperialism and much more intelligent in the way it goes about portraying the war.
Oh yeah, I saw someone say that they never refer to them by their actual Viet Minh. It's never referred to as that. It's always any movie about Vietnam is always Viet Cong. It's never or VC or NVA. It's not exactly. Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, it would be. I don't. I wonder if there's even any Vietnam movies really made recently. I can't think of any that come out anymore. Now you're getting like Iraq War, Afghan War. Soon you're gonna get what Ukraine War or something. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. They're still making movies about the Holodomor.
Is there a movie about that recently?
It was one in like 2017. It was called like Bitter Harvest.
Oh geez.
So I guess
hadn't
they
heard of
haven't
that
given
one.
that one up, but yeah. Another part of the movie, you're obviously going to get some disturbing imagery with any war movie, but especially one that's supposed to make you realize the senselessness and the reality of warfare and combat. But one of the more disturbing ones is when there's a disabled person with one leg,
Yeah.
and he basically, the U.S. soldiers torture him and kill him. One of the soldiers decides not to kill him, and then the other one does. And I mean, and this is a personal anecdote, but one of my friends in the military has told me that they heard a story from one of the people in their platoon that basically that happened in Afghanistan. But they were raiding a house, and they gunned down somebody who was disabled, and basically lied about it. And this is a secondhand story. This is me hearing this from my friend who heard it from someone in the military. But this kind of, you might think that's like gratuitous or over the top, but like it's the kind of stuff that happens, especially like I said, when you're in that combat situation, you're tense and you're constantly on edge and fighting for your life.
I mean, it's yeah. When I saw that scene, I thought the same way. Like, oh, is this over the top? But then I'm thinking, no, like they're trained. I mean, that's the thing about like Barnes's character. He is instilled in them that you have to basically shoot first. You cannot, he'll stand up for you if there's a hearing or whatever it is, on your behalf. That was another kind of thing also, is that when there was sort of some controversy, they all kind of circle around Barnes and will say like, we'll tell the story you want to be told. So it really doesn't surprise me that they would do that. And I mean, this is not like meant to be a defense of the soldiers or their actions, but they're honestly must all just be terrified all the time. I mean, like they can't sleep. They're like half the group is like doing drugs because otherwise they can't live through this event too, which I think is another interesting aspect of this movie.
It is.
And also totally true. Like there is lots and lots of drug use when people were there. So it's can't imagine.
Yeah, someone I know who is stationed in Afghanistan told me it's the same thing with the opium that's grown there. It's just everywhere, and people just take it because of to relax, and like you said, try and get away from constantly being on edge and fearing for your life. And yeah, like you were saying about Barnes, there's one point where he's like criticizing Washington D.C., and it's the only time where someone I think says something like explicitly political. When he's like, when's Washington, or when are the idiots in Washington going to give us basically the go ahead to shoot first? the go ahead to massacre civilians. So they're not complaining that they're there. They're not complaining that they're in this senseless warfare situation. They're complaining, or he's complaining, that the government won't give them the green light to gun down civilians,
Yeah.
which they do anyways.
Yeah, they're not shy about what they're doing. I mean, yeah, and what was I gonna? There's something else about the drug thing that I was thinking about. It'll come back to me. Actually, one thing I noticed, and only because I know that you're a wrestler, I think at one point the lieutenant is wearing a wrestling T-shirt. I don't know if you caught that, like little bit. Like there, I think it was when they're playing poker and drinking. He like walks into the room or something, and he has on like a wrestling shirt from Pennsylvania, or I don't know where it was from, but I was like, oh yeah, they're just, and it makes sense though that might be someone who's a lieutenant or someone who's in charge because he has strategy,
Totally. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of wrestlers in the military, and I mean, this is not super related, but I've heard, if you put on your resume that you were a wrestler or if you were in the military, that's what they tell wrestlers growing up. Like, if you finish wrestling in college or if you put on your resume that you're in the military, you can get hired anywhere. So there's a lot of overlap. We do wrestling teams do military appreciation nights all the time. Recruiters are, they prey on college students. So yeah, a lot of overlap there. I wish I would have seen that. I would have written it in my notes.
Yeah, it was like a really quick thing. I don't think I ever had noticed. I mean, I'm not usually when I'm watching a movie, I'm not like making notes of things as I'm doing it. But yeah, it's an interesting thing. And the other thing too about this, I know we've kind of like jumped around a bit, but the one thing about the movie that we talked about class a little bit, like as far as most of the people there are probably pretty poor, working class families, but there is kind of like a separation between like most of the people in the movie who are soldiers of color tend to have been with like the group that was counting the days till they got home, whereas I feel like I don't know, like the people that you picture as like would have become cops if that would have been like their next choice instead of going to the military, they're like excited about being there and amped up. It's kind of a weird, but they didn't treat them differently. They didn't like send the black troops in like as a frontliner. You know what I mean? I know there's been talk, I've heard of that in Vietnam and other wars where they put the people of color up front.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that, but now that looking back on it, you're right. All the people of color were likable characters. They're just wanting to get home.
Had families. They talked about like things. They're ladies.
Yeah, and it's almost like it kind of represents what was going on domestically in the U.S. You have like the sort of drug doing, pot smoking hippies who are against the war, and they're kind of on to what's happening. And then you have people of color who are obviously at that time the most revolutionary in the U.S. You have the civil rights movement going on, which is every socialist and communist group is backing that. You have the Black Panthers, of course, around that time. Mm-hmm. And then you have like the bloodthirsty neocons, basically. So yeah, I feel like now that we're talking about it, I didn't think about this when I was watching it, but I feel like almost the groups who are there could parallel the groups back home politically.
Yeah, that's actually a good way to look at it, because you could easily see, I think what's his name, the guy who plays Keith David's character, I think is King is his name, and also Big Harold, who's Forrest Whitaker, who isn't in the movie that much, but they both are talking about things they want to do when they get home. They actually are thinking about like a life beyond Vietnam, where I feel like some of the other characters they don't really have any. What do they have for themselves? They don't see this as, they see this as their future, like moving up in the ranks in the military.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah. Pretty much like military careerism. I'm sorry, I was checking out the plot. Somebody was saying that Barnes didn't make that quote about being a war hero. It was Bunny. I don't remember which character Bunny was, but it says Bunny. I just want to correct this because I got it wrong.
Sorry, that's Kevin Dillon is the actor who plays Bunny.
Oh, okay. And he said he states no, or he says he feels no remorse for the murders. he enjoyed Vietnam and proclaims that he'll call himself Audie Murphy, a famous and highly decorated World War II hero. So he's not saying he'll be a hero in Vietnam. He's saying he'll go home and be pretend to be a World War II hero. So just to get the record straight on that.
Yeah, no, yeah, I wasn't sure who said that, but I thought it was. It feels like Tom Berenger, who's the Sergeant Barnes too. I mean, his character is also like, even though he's very unlikable, he's like he's portrayed as like the military badass. He's got a scar on his face. He's very much like, I think he's like multiple tours of duty. He knew everything. He probably was one of those people that was sent there early on as like one of those special units. I think Special Forces was like the early Vietnam, right?
Yeah. And they're known for being obviously more hardened and doing a lot of the dirty work.
And actually another thing about like the unit that was interesting. So the guy who had the wrestling shirt on, I think is Lieutenant Wolf, I think is his name. He like doesn't, for the first 3/4 of the movie, like barely is in charge. I feel like it's always Sergeant Barnes who's calling the shots, and he's just kind of like, okay, fine, that's what you say we'll do. And then I think later in the movie he kind of, maybe he never changes. Actually, I feel like he's just kind of this. He's afraid, whereas Barnes is not afraid. I don't know if that really plays into the movie, but it adds on to that like hardened character that you have to be to survive. Like you can't survive the war if you're not, I don't want to say tough, because like you can be tough but not be a war profiteer or
right. Almost like you have to lose your humanity and put your life above pretty much anything else and almost embrace the situation you're in. But I mean, then you also have O'Neill, who is also one of the higher ups, and he survives the end fight by hiding under a dead body.
Yeah, which is a common thing apparently.
Really?
Yeah. So there's I feel like all these are like stories in dispatches. There is a story of someone who hides under a bunch of dead bodies, and actually what the Vietnamese would do after I guess they quote unquote won the little fight, they would go through and check all the bodies, but somehow this particular, I wonder if that's what this was based on, that was the parallel.
That's interesting. I wonder, is the burning and killing of the people in the village, is that based on the My Lai massacre or anything?
I looked into that a bunch and I couldn't find any definitive like one-to-one proof. It sounded more like it was just meant to just represent like a common thing that happened during Vietnam. And I think that the My Lai massacre was much bigger. I feel like there was hundreds of people who died, whereas that was like only a couple dozen.
Right. Yeah, that's what I thought, was they killed a few people and then burned the village, but they didn't kill a lot of people. My Lai was probably more deaths. Something that was interesting though was how they shot the pig in the village, and this lady comes up and she says, we're farmers, we have to make a living, which you see the economic toll that was put on Vietnam by the bombing and by the destruction, destroyed their infrastructure. And Vijay Prashad says like their transition to socialism after they would have kicked the French out, or after they kicked the French out, would have been fairly easy. Yep. They had fairly, their productive forces had been developed to a fairly high level. After Vietnam, they had to completely rebuild because their infrastructure and their farmland was destroyed by the Agent Orange and the napalm. So kind of see that in the movie with the farmer protesting that they killed her pig.
Yeah, and then I think there's a line too right after that where they capture one of, I think I wrote this down. So after that happens, they say to put them in the pig pen. So they literally put the just innocents from the town into like the pen, I guess in like the pig, shit and whatever. Like that's what they thought of the people. They're just like, you're animals. I mean, that's kind of hard to get that image away.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think they say it explicitly, like put them in the pig pen. And that's, the first thing I thought was treating humans like animals. And I don't know. And also, like, you might think, because that lady who's protesting them killing her pig, you might think, why is this lady doing this? This is silly or stupid. But this is just a dumb thought I had. But imagine if another country invaded the U.S., if another country was running through U.S. towns and doing stuff like this. Like, you know how many people would protest, or we have like Karens in the US. I don't know if people don't like that word or not, but we have people who will complain about everything. They'll make customer service workers' lives hell. Versus these people had their home invaded, their homeland trampled by a country that they never attacked or never did anything to. It just, I don't know. Now I see the movie from, a Marxist or leftist lens and against the war, and I end up, rooting for the Viet Minh against a lot of the Americans. But I don't know. Before you have that view, you're induced with a lot of propaganda, and like watching the film with my roommates, it was just interesting to hear some of the stuff they would say. Like, why is that lady doing that? Why is she complaining? And I'm like, because they're in her home, because they're trampling her village. Like, don't ask why she's complaining. That's why they're there.
I mean, and it's a thing where you probably in her mind, she's thinking like, this is a bad idea. Like, there's these people around me with guns, but it's almost like they think that maybe because given like the time period, you weren't like texting your friend in another village, like, oh, this is what's happening in our village. They kind of, I don't know how easily news and information was traveling, but I mean, well, do you know this? Do you know if villages understood like the entire invasion at the time, like what was happening across the whole country? And they had to have good information because they were preparing. They had guns, like hidden in the rice and stuff.
Yeah, I mean that's a good question because they had just fought the struggle against Japan. I'm sorry, not Japan,
France.
against the French, and I mean the communists were doing what communists do, educating people, teaching them about imperialism. Their whole revolution and anti-colonial struggle was based on Marxism, Leninism. So I have to imagine, a lot of them knew, a lot of the ones who were educated Marxism, Leninism, but I'm sure they didn't get to everybody. I'm sure there were a lot of people who never, learned to read or whatever else, because they had limited resources, and most of their resources, the socialists and communists, were going towards fighting the wars. So I have to imagine there were a lot who weren't aware.
Yeah, no, and actually, what's you mentioned the thing with Vijay Prashad and kind of how they were preparing, and I was in this book. It was mentioning how in the 50s, Ho Chi Minh was extremely popular. I mean, he was very popular, and the U.S. prevented elections from happening. And I think it was 1954, or no, I'd have to look at the year. As they do, the Geneva Convention had already occurred. They said they're going to have fair elections, and they wouldn't let them have them because Ho Chi Minh would have gotten 80% of the vote. And they not only were they popular, is they were prepared to move to the next phase, as you were saying. Is that so? I think they're to that point. I think that people across the whole country knew what was happening, at least in the barest sense.
That's interesting. You're probably right, especially if Ho Chi Minh had that high of an approval rating. And I like this comment here from SCH. Ho Chi Minh was trying to appeal to the U.S.'s heart, but it got him nothing. Yeah, during the anti-colonial struggle against the French, Ho Chi Minh called on the U.S. to come help the Vietnamese. He said, look, your constitution's based on freedom, democracy. We're trying to fight for our sovereignty here. We're trying to bring our people freedom. And instead of helping them, the U.S. waited for the French to lose their colony and then did the Vietnam War. Tried to basically capture this colony that the French had lost, bringing utter devastation to the country in the process. So, yeah, that's what happens when you try to appeal to the heart of U.S. imperialists, I guess. No fault to Ho Chi Minh. He was obviously exposing their hypocrisy.
Right.
I'm sure he knew, but.
And this is actually an interesting fact that you mentioned about this is that apparently Ho Chi Minh had a picture of George Washington on his desk and a copy of the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, like next to it. And he wanted to write the Declaration or sort of the Constitution for Vietnam. And I think it actually ended up starting with the same line of all men are created equal. It's like he actually looked up to not America's actions that, that no one would want to look up to, but he did see it as like a struggle that he could bring to his people. But
right. Yeah. And I mean, this is a little bit off topic from the movie, but it's interesting backstory, especially because, like you said, the like we said earlier, the movie doesn't totally focus on the Vietnamese perspective or really at all. But Ho Chi Minh traveled through Europe and was reading like the Enlightenment thinkers. And he was influenced by a lot of Western ideas and applying them to a Vietnamese context. And
Mhm.
I mean, he, like anybody else under colonial dominance, he hated the French. He thought France was evil. Similar to Che Guevara in his youth, who said like he thought the U.S. was run by evil wizards and dark princes. That's Ho Chi Minh felt like that about the France. Why would they be doing this? Why would they be doing this to us? But then he goes to France and he's like, oh, the French people aren't uniquely evil. It's capitalism. It's the capitalist imperialists run their country and do this horrible stuff for capital expansion, and then they lie to the people at home about it. So after that, he becomes a Marxist and a communist and attacks capitalism.
I think you mentioned before too, is that Ho Chi Minh had basically begged Washington DC, America, for aid to fight the French, and they're like, nope, we're just going to give more stuff to the French. And like a story as old as time. I mean, usually they're not asking for funds, but they're always going to fund. It's kind of funny that America was funding France, and then when they were planning to do their treaty with Vietnam, the U.S. is like, actually, we're going to stop giving you military aid. And there was apparently a joke, like in the French press, that the U.S. was like the biggest boost of the French economy because they were giving them all this aid, like $2 billion or something crazy.
Huh. I didn't even know that, but I mean, it makes perfect sense because you have the Marshall Plan at the end of World War II, where the U.S. is giving all this, all these low interest loans to their allies in Europe. And yeah, I mean, it makes sense that they would funnel military resources and money until, the French did what the U.S. didn't want, until they tried to make peace
Exactly.
and
And
end
they
the blood.
did, yeah. And they finally leave, and then the U.S. is like, well, we need to just stick around. That's when they started bringing in the troops. They brought in something like 800 special op forces, I think in 1955, 56, something like that. And that was sort of the precursor to, I mean, it's funny, at the same time, we're fighting Korea, or by fighting, I mean just bombing half the country. It wasn't really much of a fight.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if we said this. Did we say this on stream that it was a similar conflict to Korea?
I don't think so. Yeah, but I mean, that's another, I think, aspect of the Vietnam War, is that it is very similar to the Korean War. As I think it was in one of your videos you posted a couple days ago about something about the DPRK and the war, and was arguing with someone and who was saying like, oh well, yeah, they crossed the line, and so that was the reason that they attacked, North Korea. It's like, no, that's actually just kind of that's not true.
It's just nonsense. It's people say the same thing about Vietnam, like, oh, they attacked the South. Like, you can't just prop up a leader with no popular support, like plop him in this country and say you all have to obey him, otherwise, we're gonna call it an invasion. Like Singham Rhee in South Korea. That's literally what he was. Came out of U.S. or trained up in U.S. universities, and they just plopped him here. And there's like, here's your president. And of course, the North, nobody listened to him, and the North was going to liberate the entire peninsula. And that's when the U.S. bombing campaign started, and 20% of their population was killed. So yeah, I mean, it's similar with the Vietnam. They tried to just back the U.S.'s preferred groups. These preferred groups didn't get any support, so they started sending, small troop presence, which escalated and escalated and escalated to the point where we're dropping tons and tons of Agent Orange and napalm. And the strategy, like you said earlier, was basically, plop down, you set up camp and go into the woods and kill as many as possible. And then when camp's overrun, just blast it with Agent Orange and napalm. So it's the most destructive military strategy you could think of. But
well, and the other thing too, the other comparison you mentioned, sort of how they trained, the people in South Korea. I think what also happened in Vietnam is they were supporting, obviously, South Vietnam, and they sent all of these people to train in the Philippines, and they built a bunch of Air Force, Army bases and whatnot down there. And that was sort of what enabled them to actually attack and go into Vietnam in the mid 60s, is because they had built the infrastructure that they were using for French, I think is what happened. So
wow, that's fascinating.
What's that?
I just want to know where you read that because
So
I
this
hadn't
is
heard.
this is all the same. It's all from Killing Hope, William Blum. He has it's basically like a chapter of like every chapter in the book is like a different U.S. Invasion or coup basically, and so I think that actually came out of the Panama Papers, but I'm not sure. I might be conflating things. Yeah, I would definitely recommend that book for anyone who just wants to read about each individual horrific thing that the U.S. has done over the last 60, 70 years.
Yeah, William Blum is good. I've read some of his stuff on East Germany and shared some the other day. So I'll have to check that out. It's interesting that the book is called Killing Hope, though, because
Yeah.
if you look at Vietnam and the Viet Minh, it's one of the most hopeful stories. Ultimately, they had millions of their people killed, but they held on to their sovereignty and moved towards constructing socialist society, the kind of society they want to create. Same with Korea. And people get so mad and call us tankies when we support these revolutionary movements or support Ho Chi Minh. It's like, read their history. How could you not support them?
Yeah, I mean,
They were
honestly, supporting
invading.
the other side, you're literally supporting fascists. I mean, like the South
Right.
Vietnamese government was literally referred to as fascistic by the U.S. government. Like in the Panama
Right.
Papers, the CIA basically said they were fascists. Like you're gonna
And one
support
of
that?
Right. I mean, literally, like Vaush, not to bring up someone none of us want to hear or talk about, but he literally said that in our back and forth. He's like, of course it would have been better if the South took over the Korean Peninsula instead of the North. Yeah, they were fascist a little bit because of us, but it still would have been better than communism. Like, oh, a communist who thinks the fascists are better than commies. Sounds
Yeah,
like you're
that
not a real communist there.
yeah, that would be my thought too. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of other crazy facts in this too. Is that in the 1950s, the U.S. planted a bunch of scholars at Michigan State University to basically come up with the plans for Vietnam, including how they would basically any Vietnamese that was 15 years or older was required to create a government ID, say who they were from, their religious information. So it's like another instance of the CIA infiltrating, and just doing what they want.
Right. And I mean, we have more than enough examples of that at
Yeah,
this
yeah.
point.
It's at some points it becomes a little bit overkill. Well, I guess not really.
And it's wild that you have Henry Kissinger when there are still Vietnam War veterans with PTSD today. And in the movie on his, as there's a really powerful scene, not only when they're leaving the part where one of the sergeants gets killed, his name's, that's a really powerful scene too.
Yeah. Oh
What's
God, that was.
what's his name again? Sorry, I'm blanking.
Elias, right?
Elias, yeah. Yeah, that was a really powerful scene. Um, and when he's leaving, Charlie Sheen's character is leaving, he starts crying, looking at the devastation, talks about having to rebuild his life. All the lives that were destroyed by this. You have Henry Kissinger, sitting in a sitting in immense wealth and privilege after committing genocide.
Yeah, I mean that whole thing, that plot of the movie. I remember when I was younger and I saw this movie, I always found that kind of part where literally two sergeants are going at each other, and Barnes lies and says he died, and then they all see him from the helicopter actually alive and have to watch him then die for real. And I don't know how. That's one thing I don't know how realistic if there were actually soldiers that were turning on each other to that point, because it wasn't like he was actually siding with the Vietnamese. He was just being like, maybe we shouldn't do as much as we're doing.
Right, and potentially could have been one of the people who snitched on Barnes, who had committed all these war crimes.
Yeah, that's probably true. He probably was, I mean, you think that they would take him out of there once they knew these things, but they're like, well, he's actually a good soldier, so.
Right, yeah, and I think they float the idea beforehand, like, oh, what if he talks? And they talk about killing each other, but yeah, I also wonder how realistic that was and how many times that was happening. And I mean, it's interesting too, even after that scene, when Elias dies, the troops are back at base talking about it, and Charlie Sheen's character wants to turn him in.
Yeah.
As does one of the other characters. I believe an African American character too, going back to how they were, more revolutionary in this movie. But
Yeah.
they're talking about turning him in, then the other guy's like, no, we're not going to turn him in. So getting away with war crimes, another huge theme.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, well, I mean, I guess the idea is you could turn him in and they could say you did this other war crime. I mean, it's in the jungle, like whose word was it? Like one, PTSD soldier versus another. I mean, I think the thing with the
Literally.
My Lai massacre was that there was lots of witnesses that weren't, journalists that witnessed it. So I think that's what I believe is why it. I don't know. Actually, I feel like that's
I,
what I don't remember now.
You're right. I mean, so many had to be covered up that what I was thinking is we probably have no idea what the actual death toll is. And like, if you look at the death toll for Iraq, and since Vietnam, the media has largely been barred from war zones. The U.S. military has gotten way more stringent with what kind of media they'll allow to just film what they're doing. Because Vietnam was, after the television had become wildly popular in the U.S., so part of what spurred the anti-war movement was the fact that the media was there and people were seeing
Right.
all these massacres for the first time. Like, oh, this is the reality of war more so than World War II when they were reading about it. But I can't
I,
remember where I was going at
oh, I
after
think I
that.
think you were talking about like the deaths in Iraq too, maybe.
Oh yeah, I was
Or
just saying we probably don't like if you look up the death statistics in Iraq, they're all over the place.
yeah, they're like 100,000 to 500,000 for
Right,
like for just Iraqis.
right, yeah. So it's we'll probably never know. We didn't, necessarily have the technology to keep track of those things back then, or the census data or whatever.
And I'm sure they're lowballing it, military, like, oh well, yeah, I mean, I guess it's easy to know how many American troops died because there's records, but we
Mm-hmm.
don't really care how many of their people died. Like in our mind, that's the casualty of war. I think there's someone, what was I going to say? Saying like, oh well, like war is, I don't know if this is the movie where they mentioned war is hell. I don't know where that quote originates from. I know it's like a commonly used one. I think that Charlie Sheen's character midway through this movie uses that term, which is, almost like a cliche, but he's like, yes, it's war as hell. Or he says, let's see, I think he just calls it hell.
Right. And the movie does, along with giving a political message, it just does a really good job, like visually and from a story perspective, of showing that war is hell, like showing the reality. Pretty much every scene, there's something crazy happening
Yeah.
that's threatening the lives of the main characters and killing some of them. So
Yeah. One conversation that I made a note of that I thought was super interesting and also at the same time kind of surprising is like Chris Taylor, Charlie Sheen's character, he signed up, he actually enlists and he thinks he's fighting for America. And like at the first he's sort of hesitant. He's like, oh, what's this seems kind of crazy. But then he has a conversation before Elias dies, and Elias tells him that they're going to lose the war. And Chris basically Taylor says, like us, America, we're going to lose. It's like it's almost hard to believe because that's what you've been
right,
told that you can win. But here
right,
there's no winning.
right. That America's the best, and that we can. And I think Elias says like we have it coming to us after we won the last few wars, where there was
Exactly.
more of a decisive victory. But like you said, how what is winning in that scenario? What does that even mean? And it's funny. I remember as a kid asking my grandma, like, has the U.S. ever lost a war? And I was so like hoping that we had never lost a war. I wanted the U.S. to be the best and number one and win all these wars. And my grandma said Vietnam, actually. And she's like, well, nobody really won. It's just a lot of people died. But I mean, that's the kind of mindset that you have, or when you're indoctrinated with as a kid. Is America number one, American exceptionalism. You see that in that scene where he's like, what do you mean? How could we lose? And it's like, we just have no chance here. We don't understand the terrain. We're in their home territory. They're prepared for this. There's, no really achievable objectives here.
Yeah, I mean they weren't really prepared to fight in a place like that. I mean, it's one thing to send in special forces. I mean, I feel like it's the same thing with Iraq and Afghanistan. Like we weren't really prepared to fight in a desert war. You know, it's like
Right.
American military spends so much money on its, war machine, but it's what are they really buying? I mean, other than like
Right. It's all
stocks for the contractors, basically.
right. It's all for the military industrial complex. I mean, that's what keeps it going. And like, if you talk to the troops, they'll tell you how much money is wasted. And there's actually a really, really good book by a journalist and academic named Nick Terse called The Complex, where he lays out basically just the military industrial complex, all the companies that make it up. And like on military bases now, there's like Starbucks and like Apple stores. So they're literally every corporation in America is attached to the military industrial complex, and they make money in all these different ways. Doesn't mean we have the best military. It doesn't mean we have more advanced missiles than Russia or China or whatever. They're actually catching up to us and surpassing us than that. I'm not an expert in military strategy and stuff, but as far as I know, they're surpassing us. The U.S. is just this big bloated military industrial complex being funneled money by our government that's siphoned out of the working class.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about where so between World War II and Vietnam, there was obviously the Korean War, which is, I mean, a similar kind of territory. So, I mean, the ramping up of military spending too after World War II was like a fear of like military contractors, like, oh, if we have nothing to fight, what are we gonna like? Because they turned all the factories into military factories, and so they just needed enemies. I mean, obviously they wanted to fight communism, but it was also an excuse to just sell a bunch of shit.
Right. And that was right after, I don't know when Eisenhower warned about the military industrial complex, but it was right about that time where he's like, this is forming, watch out for this. And,
Yeah.
you see with like, right. You see with Afghanistan, like we were there for so long, and there was like opium production going on. There was some oil there and some resources, but a lot of it was just paying the military industrial complex, like keeping giant bases here, with, like I said, like all these different amenities, that like consumerist amenities from corporations. It's literally just the government funneling money into Wall Street. Like, here you go, arms contractors. We'll go sit in this country for 20 years and kill people if they come close to our bases.
I mean,
So you
that
can
was like
make
the
a buck.
basis of the Iraq War, more so than it was to actually do anything. Was just to like the line, like Halliburton and the whole, all of that stuff is pretty well documented at this point. But
Right.
one other thing about the movie, I was thinking about Elias, and like the lieutenant, who I think I mentioned earlier was just kind of like an incompetent lieutenant. He gives like the wrong location of like where to bomb, and he ends up like bombing them their own location. I mean, I get that they're like talking on these phones, and it's a jungle. Like, how do they ever even hit the right target? Is impossible. It's like mind boggling. But
Right.
they're just like napalming themselves.
Right. That I had that written down to talk about, because it's like, I believe that's right after Elias is talking about how there's no way for them to win. I think that might be the very next scene.
I think you're right. It is. That is the next scene.
So, I mean, what a great way to show, from a story perspective, like how senseless this death is. So you learn they're not going to win the war. They're there for no reason. And then they napalm and kill a bunch of their own troops.
Yeah. And like, I think everyone dies except for like a couple of them are like hiding underneath, and Charlie Sheen comes out and he just like is covered in, like, I don't know how napalm works exactly. Is it just like the chemical that's on you, whatever it is? He's just a bloody mess. And like, there's no way that any of those guys would live past what, 50?
Right.
If they even make it, if they make it out, I mean, they're just,
which is the effect that, like you said, the Vietnam death stats now have to take into account the amount of people who were poisoned, and their farmland was poisoned too. They couldn't grow crops forever. And so stupid, you have reactionaries in America who will be like, oh, look at these socialist countries. Socialism hasn't worked. They're poor. Like we bombed their freaking agricultural supply with Agent Orange and napalm and poisoned it. And then it's their fault for not being as rich as us. Like, give me a break.
Well, it's like the same thing, like criticism of a country like Cuba, where like everything was destroyed, and then we embargo them so they can't actually trade and get the things they need. It's
Mhm.
like, oh, how come this poor country can't bootstrap itself up on socialism? It's like, well, actually, I know why.
Right. And Cuba has been under the most stringent embargo in human history since the 59 revolution. The only other one that compares is the US sanction regime on the DPRK on North Korea, which, like we said, is a lot of parallels to Vietnam, where the US destroyed their infrastructure, killed 20% of their population, then put them under these stringent sanctions. And they're like, why aren't you rich? And even Jimmy Carter admitted that, the US has done everything they can to boost up South Korea and done everything they can to destroy North Korea. And then, we look at them and we're like, why are you like this? Why aren't you as consumeristic and wealthy as us?
Yeah.
And I have one more point that I forgot to say earlier when we were talking about how they even have these statistics about like the death statistics from
Oh, yeah.
war. The ones from Korea that I list, the 15 to 20% of their population, and U.S. Pilots were running out of targets to bomb because they destroyed everything. That's from U.S. military personnel. That's from Curtis LeMay, who was, one of the leading Air Force commanders during the Korean War. He's the one who estimated 15 to 20% of the population. So that's kind of interesting too.
Yeah, I think not just I think it's not just 20% of the population, but I feel like it's 80% of like any building, like infrastructure was also wiped away just like in an instant.
Every building over 2 stories tall is
Yeah,
another
that's it.
quote from a U.S. personnel, and Pyongyang was just leveled before the war. They called Korea the Jerusalem, or Pyongyang was called the Jerusalem of the East because they had so many churches, and after the war they were all gone.
Yeah. I've just recently been listening to the Blowback podcast about the seasons about South Korea, like the war there. And I would recommend anyone who hasn't listened to it, but it goes pretty in depth. And they mentioned what you're talking about with North Korea was a beautiful country, or a beautiful, I don't want to call it a country, a beautiful place. And the same thing with Middle East, in Libya. I mean, those are beautiful places that we just destroyed.
Yeah, people talk about Iraq in the most heinous way, and I mean it shows how successful U.S. brainwashing and Islamophobic propaganda has been. But people talk about Iraq like it's nothing, and they'll, just there's this joke in the U.S. like, oh, let's just nuke the Middle East, get rid of all the terrorists, and it's like this is Mesopotamia. Iraq is Mesopotamia. The Middle East is was the cradle of human civilization, the place where human civilization exploded. Do you know how much history there is there, and how much knowledge and stuff to learn that we just bombed, destroyed? It's like
Yeah.
the old school imperialist crusaders or whatever, when they would burn down libraries as they pillaged places. Like that's basically what the U.S. is doing in modern day with modern weaponry.
Yeah, basically, yeah. Um, the one of the other notes I had here too, I think it was soon after this, soon after when they bombed themselves or napalm themselves, Barnes is talking to, I don't remember who he was talking to, but he tells the people that he has no problem with anyone who does what he's told. And then I think he says, but if you don't, the machine breaks down. And I think I thought that was interesting the way they call it like a machine. And I think like a well-oiled machine, like everyone has to follow the orders of the person above them. And if you do all these things, but in Vietnam, like really, it just, I mean, maybe in World War II, you could argue in some of the battles, like if you follow the command line, things would quote unquote work out. But in this case, no. I mean,
Right. And that kind of shows, I mean, he says we need to follow the machine, and like you said, there could be some logic there if it was a just war, or if you were fighting Hitler or
Nazis.
whatever,
Yeah.
Nazis, right? But here it doesn't make, the machine is the military industrial complex. The machine doesn't care about you. The machine's literally sending you to die. And then if you get PTSD when you come back, the machine's not going to take care of you.
Right.
So it's by disobeying the machine that we're going to get out of this situation where this imperialist oligarchy is running our lives.
Yeah, yeah. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I think, and it's funny you said that because I think right after that part, I don't remember which soldiers are talking about it, but they're saying, "Oh, once we get out of Vietnam, they're going to they're going to be good to go." I think like he might have, I don't know if he used that exact words, if that was my paraphrasing it. Like they're going to be taken care of. We're going to live nice lives after this, and we know that's like, I think about like Lieutenant Dan from Forrest Gump. Like he comes home without his legs and he's barely scraping by, living in off the government, but like not well. And
Right.
so we don't care about the troops once they come back. You're an expendable body.
Exactly. And I have a friend who works, she's a social worker, works mostly with vets. And I mean, there's still a lot of people. She told me, she's like, there's still so many people messed up from like Vietnam, who are still around and remember it. And it's crazy the lasting effect that it's had. And she's told me too, there are like programs that the military will make available, but you have to go do them yourself. And they're super,
Right.
super hard, and needlessly complex on purpose because they want to pay as little money as possible. And that scene was interesting. I think he said like it's going to be gravy once we get back.
Gravy. Yeah, that's the word. Yeah, yeah.
All right, and you're watching that like no, they're just they're doing drugs and doing whatever they can to just get through this time period. But then when they go home, as Charlie Sheen says at the end of the movie, they're going to have to rebuild their lives with trauma and PTSD.
Yeah, I mean, they already have seen things that no one should, I mean, like really you should never have to see, and they're being forced to, right? They're at least the ones who are, well, I would argue that even the people who are enlisting are almost forced to because they don't really have another avenue for their life, unfortunately, for a lot of people.
Right. And Vietnam was the last war where we had the draft, so there were people just, scooped up. I think it was the last war where we had the draft, right? Am my history correct there?
Yeah, yeah. There's no other. I think the draft was like for 10 years, but I think it only was like pretty heavy early on. I don't remember.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Someone says,
67 to 74 or something like that.
huh, right. I see someone here saying Trump dodged the draft. I don't know if that's true, but I remember liberals attacking him over that. I remember liberals saying, "Oh, you didn't go massacre people for us in Vietnam. You're worse than all the good Republicans like John McCain, who you mentioned earlier."
Yeah, yeah. I think the Trump like pretended he had a bone spur, or is that John
Yeah,
Kerry? I don't
bone
know which
spurs.
one of them. Yeah,
Yeah,
right. Didn't John Kerry like dodge the war, and then like of course it was the opposite. Like Republicans were roasting him for that. So it's like it doesn't
right,
matter what side, you're just going to get roasted basically.
right, for doing the right thing. And thankfully now, I think a lot of people know, like Muhammad Ali dodged the draft, and he got so much shit. Like people were, and of course, obviously, you had like horrific racism out in the open at that time too. So people were just lambasting him, calling him a coward. And, why don't you move out of America if you hate it so much? Just because he doesn't want to participate in what amounts to attempted genocide on the people of Cambodia and Vietnam.
Yeah, yeah. That's well. I mean, I think yeah, like you're saying, it's obviously was racially based. If it had been, I don't know. I think about like athletes who went to fight during World War II. I mean, World War II was also seen differently. It was like seen as like a justified invasion. Like I think of like Ted Williams, baseball player. Like he goes to the war, he's like seen as a hero for doing it. Whereas, if a black player had done that, they would have probably not felt the same.
Right, right. You have the um, always the element of racism there. It's used. I mean, imperialism's so cynical. It's going to use racial divisions to prey on and divide the working class any way they can.
Yeah. One of the last notes I had, I think this is pretty close to the end of the movie. Like the end is kind of like is not very like they have the tanks rolling through and it's not that satisfying, but they kind of like feel like they've won a victory, which is really just them bombing the crap out of them. But the tank, when it comes through, did you notice it had a Nazi flag on it, a swastika?
I did not notice that.
And I looked it up to see what the reasoning was for, and I couldn't find any quotes from Stone. But people theorized that it was like meant to symbolize that like the diverse groups of people who were fighting, and you had people from the South who might have been, would have Confederate flags at home. So is it really that different? Like your fascism fights communism, so it's not really like a big leap, but kind of a
Right.
weird stylistic choice, if you ask me.
That is interesting. I'm sure it was intentional. And I mean, if
Oh, for sure, yeah.
the U.S. I'm not super familiar with the U.S. backed forces in Vietnam at the time, but we know, if there are fascists on the ground and communists are taking power, the U.S. will do whatever they can to help the fascists.
Right.
So I'm sure there were a lot of, interesting, like the people in Vietnam who sided with the U.S. I'm sure there were some very right wing political groups there and figures.
Well, I mean, if you think, saying that the 3/4 of the people who were fighting there had enlisted, at the time, propaganda was pretty heavy in America against, communism. So it would make sense to get people who perceive that as like they hate commies because, they think of like USSR, Russia, or whatever their image in their head was in the 60s, Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't seem like a stretch to me to like have people who are just straight up
Right.
fascists fighting in the war.
For sure. The last couple, I had two more things written down in my notes. The one was that from a filmmaking perspective, I thought the notes or the letters that Charlie Sheen's character was writing to his grandma were a good story device.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, it's kind of a big part of the movie. It's one of the more, the movie's about, we're mostly focusing on the politics and the economics and imperialism aspect, but it's also sort of about like the duality of man, with where you have, the more empathetic sergeant versus the violent evil one.
Right.
And then you have Charlie Sheen's character writing to his grandma at first, like, these are the best soldiers I've ever met. They're the best of the best. And slowly his letters home get more depressing and more cynical to the point by the end of the movie where he's not even writing home.
Yeah. Someone asked him if he's still writing. He's like, no, I'm not doing that anymore.
Right. Yeah. He's just totally like sort of embraced the war and the situation he's in, doesn't even feel like writing home to explain what's going on.
Yeah. That does like, that makes you feel, it was, obviously you said it was like a plot device, but it makes you feel like empathetic for the soldiers. In his case, he volunteered to go, but still like you're meant to still, like these are like 19-year-old, 20, 21-year-old kids that are there, like just dropped in the middle of a jungle and be like, just go kill people. Yeah, like I said, like I'm not trying to like support what they're doing, but at the same time, like you feel pretty bad for them, what they're going through.
Right. And honestly, I think it's a testament to Oliver Stone that this movie does make you empathize with the American, or some of the Americans, some of them not so much. But it's not like a sermonizing movie where he's just preaching at you the whole time.
Right.
It's very subtle, and from a film, I'm not a film expert, but it's a good film, even if it wasn't for the political message, I feel like.
And actually, a crazy thing that I saw too, or I think I knew this before, but it was made for only $6 million. It was like considered like a low budget movie, which almost feels impossible given. Like it looks good, I guess there aren't that many. There are lots of explosions. The special effects back then weren't exactly top level, but it like looks good for $6 million, kind of. And it made 130 million, I think. Yeah, 138 million on 6 million.
That's why you got to make more anti-imperialist movies, Hollywood.
Yeah.
People like it.
It reminds me of a lot of movies like John Carpenter movies where he makes all those low budget movies. And they don't all do really well, but that's really kind of how you have to make a movie like that. You have to make a low budget movie that you're willing to fund.
Yeah.
Not necessarily yourself, but through different channels,
Right. Platoon, I'm sure, didn't have a bunch of movie studios looking to shell out money. And if you look at Oliver Stone's newest movie, Ukraine on Fire, which is about an issue that's going on right now that the U.S. is trying to lie about, like, you can barely find it. And if you go to it on YouTube, you have to log into your account and show that you're 18 years or older. It's got all these barriers to actually viewing it. So yeah, there's there's not a lot of funding for stuff like this. And as we were saying at the beginning, it's impressive that Oliver Stone even got this movie made. The last thing I had written in my notes was something I read after Charlie Sheen's character has the showdown with Barnes, and he kills him. He goes for the grenade and almost pulls the pin. He like fumbles with the pin and thinks about committing suicide, which wasn't in the script. Oliver Stone said Charlie Sheen just did that because he thought the character would do it, and they left it in the movie because Oliver Stone thought it was good, which is crazy. But I mean, I can't. There's a bunch of insane statistics about the number of veteran suicides, but estimated 50 to 100,000 Vietnam veterans committed suicide, which is insane.
God, that's insane. Oh, wow.
So yeah, it touches on that as well.
Yeah, I didn't know that fact, that part was like improvised, because it kind of like plays into his like character development. Like, you don't get that much character development from anyone except, I mean, the story is told through his eyes, so it makes sense that it's through his eyes, but he, like, the letters slowing down, he's depressed, he's counting down the days, like he knows. I remember like they asked him early on, like, how many days left? He's like 354 or something, because he'd been there for like a week, and he's just, you know, like, they're kind of like you got to find some way to look at that as positive, and he's depressed. And yeah, it does kind of make sense that he would just blow himself up at the same time as blowing up, you know, this piece of shit lieutenant, sergeant, whatever.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Shout out to Charlie Sheen before he went a little bit haywire, I guess.
Yeah, I was trying to look to see. So this is another random stat. Apparently, they wanted Al Pacino in this movie, but he it doesn't say what happened. Like, he didn't want to do it, or they just couldn't. They probably didn't want to have to pay him as much, because Al Pacino wasn't as like a rock star in like what year is this? 86. So I guess, yeah. But the other crazy thing is he wrote this script in the 70s. So this script had been sitting for a long time.
Huh.
So that probably also speaks to the fact that like they couldn't get it made.
Right. Yeah, that's probably what it was. They couldn't find funding, and they wanted to wait till it was over. Like, one of the quotes I say over and over and over again is, everybody's an anti-imperialist in hindsight. Yeah. Everybody's an anti-imperialist 20 years after the war happened. We have the Pentagon Papers and whatever else to prove that the U.S. was lying and massacring civilians. But when the U.S. is trying to manufacture consent, you know, it's like, oh, you don't support Vietnam, you're a genocide denier and a tanky and blah, 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 blah. I mean, I'm sure those weren't the words back then, but it's the same. It's the same with every U.S. intervention. You're a tanky and a denier of human rights abuses and just a real piece of shit if you're against what the U.S. is doing. Then 20 years later, it's popular. You know, now we can talk about Iraq without being a Saddam supporter or whatever.
Okay, yeah, I had friends. I was in college when the invasion of Iraq went down, and I had friends who I would like argue with for hours about, like, they were like, oh yeah, we have weapons of mass destruction, we got to go in. And I would just then being like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, this is just like, I mean, then I wouldn't have considered myself as left as I am now. And even then I could see, like, America is always lying. Like, don't you see this? And 10, 15 years later, they're like, oh yeah, actually you're right, that was bullshit. I'm like, see, like, this is like literally your point, right? You know?
Exactly. Right. You just have to wait a few years to get proven right. But then it's like, you know, I don't care about getting proven right. I wish you guys would have been against the war when it was happening, when they were lying to you about it.
Yeah. I mean, the problem is that U.S. propaganda and all that is just so effective.
I think entertainment media and, you know, the DoD's control of Hollywood is probably more effective than just straight up propaganda. Like, you have cable news,
right?
CNN and, you know, Fox supporting imperialism, of course, you know, and NYT, of course, printed the story on the front page about Saddam having weapons of mass destruction. That was false, that Judith Butler had gotten from U.S. intelligence agencies and just printed. So obviously the news and politics media is going to be corrupt. But then you have people underestimate how much they're lied to by Hollywood, and, you know, how much effort and money the imperialists put into controlling entertainment media. Like Zelensky was just on the cover of Time magazine.
Yeah.
So stuff like that has a big effect on people.
Yeah, the I saw this was came out maybe a couple years ago, but I saw something. I can't remember the guy on MSNBC. He was like a host or something like that, but he basically came out and said something to the effect of, "Oh, you know what this was? It was during the 2016 election. Basically, if they said anything bad about Hillary Clinton, like on MSNBC, they would get like a call for her campaign, being like, "You're being too mean about me." And the same thing happened also with just, they weren't allowed to be too left about anything. Like even if it was like literally moderate positions, like, sorry, you're too left. So they were, and this is like DOD, telling them this. And actually, the other thing that people tend to maybe discount, NPR is a very, very much controlled by these, like they bring people on their show that are fair and balanced, and it's basically just a State Department official just towing the company line. Like I used to think that NPR was this like unbiased source.
Mm-hmm.
It's not.
Right. My parents asked me that when I was first getting into like anti-imperialism and working my way towards socialism. They're like, "Is NPR a good source?" I'm like, "Yeah, definitely. They talk really nice, and they use big words, so they can't be in favor of murderous imperialist wars."
I mean, I think that's what makes it so effective, though, is that it's
Mm-hmm.
like, I mean, that's not to say that every show on NPR is bad. Like they have in New York and other cities, they have call-in shows about local government. Like that's okay. You're talking about your local issues, but it's the national correspondents that are just, is China in your refrigerator? We find out at 6.
Right. Yeah. No shade at the Tiny Desk concerts.
Yeah, those
But
are good.
well, yeah, it's kind of crazy, and it's crazy once you kind of. I mean, it takes a little bit to really wrap your head around how controlled everything is. How, like Michael Parenti's "Inventing Reality" is a good book to read that kind
Oh
of
yeah.
blows your mind. Where it's like, oh my gosh, the DoD and the State Department and the Pentagon control everything. The media is lying, the entertainment media um, is lying, but it's hard to see that until you realize what's going on. And then once you do, you're like, oh my God, it's NPR, it's New York Times, it's these respected news outlets too that are just blatantly lying about every single enemy state of the U.S. no
So this
matter
is
what.
so this is this reminds. I don't know why I thought of this then, but this is also from that William Blum book. So he was talking about the U.S. involvement in the 50s. This is before like the Vietnam War officially started. So what they wanted to do is they dropped leaflets in North Vietnam saying how corrupt the government was and how bad communism was, to push more people to, is it emigrate or defect? I don't know what the official word would be.
The
Basically,
fact, yeah.
to go to South Vietnam, and so they basically were creating these like fake leaflets, um, propaganda slogans for saying that the Virgin Mary had departed from the North, like playing on the religious aspect. And this is all
Wow.
like straight up CIA, just you know, run of the mill. I mean, this is abroad, so it's different, but I think in America, it's everything. And I think that's what we were talking at the very beginning, is how deeply ingrained Hollywood is to the military. And it's funny how people call Hollywood like left, like, oh, it's
Right.
in the pocket of liberals and socialists.
They're
I got into an
woke.
argument with someone recently saying how like all of the directors and studios are like communists. I'm like, I'm sorry, that's
Bro.
just not true.
It's just so far from the truth. They're owned by those darn communist multinational corporations and the darn communist U.S. State Department and Department of Defense. That's crazy. I'm glad you told me that story about the leaflets or that historical fact, because I didn't know that. And a point that I always make, because when the U.S. was doing their first coup after World War II, when they were really left as the dominant global hegemon or the main superpower, when they were coupping Guatemala, they flew planes over and did the same thing, dropped these anti-Jacobo Arbenz pamphlets, and it shows the importance of propaganda and winning the information war and how good the U.S. is at doing it. And obviously we did a podcast about Edward Bernays a while back, who's one of the, fathers of these sort of propaganda techniques. But now with Syria and Libya, a huge part of what allowed the US to do what they did was using social media, doing influence campaigns, not just here domestically, but there in Syria and Libya to get, coalitions of people to overthrow the government. They did the same thing with SOS Cuba. So, when people will call you a conspiracy theorist if you say that there's influence campaigns going on, or that, social media matters and the information war matters, but it absolutely does. If it didn't matter, the State Department wouldn't put so much money and effort
Yeah.
into it.
Right.
Obviously it's easy for me to say that as a content creator, but I used to not even think that. Like, I can do some good with social media or whatever, but there's only so much you can do or whatever, and which is true.
Yeah.
Obviously, you got to organize in real life, but it does matter. It matters to
Yeah.
debunk these lies, and that's why they kill people and arrest people who do it.
It's funny you mentioned the SOS Cuba, but I think this is like a lesser known thing, is that the State Department through US Aid tried to set up a new social media app in Cuba in, I think, 2012 or 13, purely to get people that were already, they're on the US side there on the ground to promote whatever they wanted. And I think it flopped, or there was some technical problem with it, but they will go to great lengths. And the thing about the Vietnamese leaflets is they pass them out to people in the north as if they've basically forged it being from like the Ho Chi Minh camp.
Wow.
So it wasn't just like they're dropping leaflets, they're like making it appear to be like propaganda that's meant for them.
Wow, that's so twisted.
I mean, I think about like that being your job at the CIA, is you're just like typing up. I mean, I guess it was easier back then when there was no digital fingerprint on things. I don't know. Maybe it's
Right.
harder. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. And I mean, I think that's why we get so many whistleblowers now. And old CIA agents will just be like, tell journalists or academics basically everything they did and how horrible it was, because you know those people inside these institutions are still human. A lot of them get tricked, like, I'm fighting for my country, and then their job is to do something like that, and it's like, what the fuck? Then they come out as a whistleblower and they get persecuted, like what's going on with Assange and all the
Yeah,
other.
I mean, we don't like our secrets being shared with the world. Even
Exactly.
what they wanted to do, I think in one of Parenti's books, he talks about this. No, actually, no, it wasn't a Parenti. It's I think in Vijay Prasad's Washington Bullets, he talks about how they use the idea of a conspiracy theory to make you seem crazy, and so that your idea is that's how the conspiracy theory term like became about, was anti-communist. So it's a very
Yep,
interesting thing.
that is Washington Bullets, because I've definitely used that a handful of times, or quoted that a handful of times, or showed it to people. Like,
It's
look,
such a good book. Everyone should read that.
it is. It's one of the maybe one of the most like essential reads for modern day. But yeah, the CIA said in one of their documents, like, if you're against what we're doing, or if you link us to it, if you say the CIA is doing this, we're going to call you a conspiracy theorist and link you to people who think lizards run the world or whatever, wacky conspiracies to make you seem ridiculous. So it's a stated strategy, and if you say that to people, they'll even American liberals will be like, oh, well, that's a conspiracy theory. Like, read
Yeah,
the CIA's own documents and just
yeah.
quit saying conspiracy.
I mean, I think that almost even comes around to like, I don't want to like bring up like cancel culture as like a topic, but like they use that as a way to justify, like it's almost like the new way of doing it, because we know so much about what the CIA did. It's like if you're a teacher at a university and you support Palestine, you are then deemed like, you have to be fired. And so it's like you're canceling them. And that's really what cancel culture is going after. It's people with the actual, like, not, I won't call it whistleblowers, but telling the truth. And it's
Right,
not like the rich people who like celebrities like Chris Pratt, like he's fine. Like he didn't get canceled.
right. And yeah, we don't have to open up this whole bag of
It's a
worms
huge
too much, but I
can of
think you're
worms.
100% right that, I mean, we just have to admit it. Like, the empire is cynical, and they'll use whatever they can to lie and do what they need to do, like we said. So of course they're going to co-opt social justice movements. Of course they're going to co-opt quote unquote wokeism, and use it for cynical ends, and use cancel culture to cancel people who disagree with them, and say, oh, if you don't support this invasion or these drone strikes, you're against women's rights and against the LGBTQ community, and look how woke the CIA is, aren't they great? So yeah, it's just a new emerging face of empire, and we got to realize it for what it is. It's almost like they're trying to be like left-wing imperialists now.
Yeah, this is, I don't know why I thought of this now. I made a video about this maybe a month ago, because it relates to the CIA. Is that the like Gloria Steinem was in the CIA, and she, like, they were like, even like feminists and other waves of art and literature was all CIA. Like Iowa Writers Workshop was basically funded by the CIA. So they will put whatever. I mean, this isn't really on topic, but it was related to the CIA. I just wanted to, people don't. And then but her comment about it was, she called the CIA a good organization, and like isn't as bad as people say, which I think is super funny.
Wow.
She's like, oh, I work with them. They're nice people. They don't kill anyone.
They seem cool.
Yeah, they gave me $500,000 in a briefcase. So
not as bad a guys as everyone says. That's hilarious. Well, do you have anything else that you wanted to discuss before we wrap it up? We've been going for about an hour and a half.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the movie goes, I mean, just as like my, if you have any final thoughts, but I mean, I think just generally we've already said I think its one fault is not showing kind of the plight of the Vietnamese, other than kind of as props for what the U.S. was doing. So I think that's like the one downfall of this movie. But I think anyone who hasn't seen it, I would definitely recommend checking it out. You can watch it on various. I found it for free somewhere with like ads, but you can watch it free with ads, and definitely check out other Oliver Stone movies, especially around this era, which I think were. Salvador is another one we mentioned offline. It's a really good movie to check out too.
Yeah, I agree and echo that. One of my favorites is the JFK movies. He did one
so good.
More recently. He did one a while back and then did another one, like basically saying everything I said in 1991 has been confirmed now by more leaked information. Salvador is good. My dad shows that to his students in his Spanish class. Platoon is just kind of like a classic. It's like a classic anti-war movie basically now. So yeah, I'd say that's, if you're gonna start getting into Stone's work, Platoon's probably a good one to start with. And then I would say make sure you watch Ukraine on Fire, just for the fact that it's the most relevant movie in the world today, like for Americans to watch. It is the best thing you can watch as an American to understand Ukraine. Exposes all the lies of the media, all the things that happen that we're not told about, which is why the movie's been heavily suppressed and you may not have heard of it. So
yeah, I was about to say it was briefly taken off YouTube, but I think you can still get it. And actually, this is something that that I didn't mention that has to be said, is that Oliver Stone fought in Vietnam.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
So he was in the army. He fought in 67 to 68. He was in the Marines before that, and he got like Purple Heart. He's like super decorated. Wow. So it actually makes I should have mentioned this at the beginning. So it makes even more sense that he would fit some of these stories in. So some of this shit probably happened to him.
Right. He probably witnessed it firsthand. I didn't even know that. That adds a whole new layer to it, though.
Yeah, that would have been. I forgot to mention that. I think it's kind of shows his perspective of the war. So he fought. He was not a wealthy person growing up, as far as I understand it, or he might have been like middle. Well, I'm not sure how wealthy he was, but I think that his came from a military family. Like his parents or his father had fought in World War II. So that's a good little nugget for everyone.
That is interesting. And one of the characters mentions in the film, my dad fought in World War II, or I have a military family history. So I'm sure a lot of Oliver Stone's own experiences made it in there. He actually makes a cameo in the movie as someone who gets blown up right away.
So someone said he wasn't in the Marine Corps. I misspoke. It's that he was in the Merchant Marines, not the Marine Corps.
Okay. Interesting, though.
Yeah, so that's a fun little thing. But yeah, so I saw you posted the Ukraine on Fire link. I originally had saw it and then I didn't finish it and the link was gone. This was maybe like a year ago, and then someone sent me the new one. So glad it's still available for people.
For sure. Yeah, you can. It'll always be up somewhere. You'll always be able to find it somewhere, no matter how bad they try and suppress it. So, well, thank you so much for coming on. Do you have anything that you want to promote? I've got the Left of the Projector podcast linked in our description down there. Make sure y'all go give it a follow.
Yeah,
Um,
you can. Yeah, I don't. The yeah, you can check out the podcast on whatever platform. Spotify, Apple. You can just get the if you want to use your own feeder, you can do that too. So you can go check it out. And we have an episode last week on Forrest Gump with five comrades just kind of ragging on the movie because I don't like Forrest Gump. But yeah, we're gonna be doing some more. I don't know. This stream works out pretty well. I might have to look into to doing that kind of content because it's a lot of fun to do it that way and get all the people on screen too. It's yeah, but for I got to thank you for letting me come on and taking the time to watch and talk about Platoon.
you bet. This was a lot of fun. Definitely get yourself on StreamYard if you are interested, because it just makes it really really easy. I can stream to multiple different platforms and pull up people's comments, so it might be good for you. But thank you for even presenting me with this idea. It's not some, Carlos has done some TV show and movie reviews on our channel, but it's not something we've done a lot of. But like we were saying today, the DoD is all over Hollywood. There's so much imperialist propaganda in entertainment media. This kind of content is valuable. Not only is it interesting to people, because we're talking about movies and stuff that they know about or that they've seen, but it's worthwhile to debunk all of the imperialist nonsense that's in our entertainment media surrounding us every day. So appreciate what you're doing. Yeah, hopefully some of our followers go over and give you a follow and some support there.
Awesome, yeah, and I think even beyond just like war movies, I think looking at film from a leftist perspective isn't something you see that often. So which is kind
Mm-hmm.
of what led me into doing it. Originally, this was going to be a horror movie podcast, but I thought it would be more fun to just branch out. So, but yeah, so again, you can follow Left of the Projector and look forward to taking your comments.
For sure. Thanks for coming on, comrade. And thanks everybody who watched the stream today. Thank you to the mods. Appreciate y'all always. We'll see you next time.
All right,
Solidarity.
have a good one.